Hello, welcome to anybody who's joined the webinar about Image Empire today. My name's Hannah Redler-Hawes. I work at the Open Data Institute and we'll be starting in a few minutes. If anyone who's come in would like to pop their name and where they're coming from in the chat, please feel free to do so, and please feel free not to do so if you don't want to. I'll start. Just give it another minute and then Una Murphy will introduce all of the speakers. Nice to see you, Tina and Linda, or not to see you. Hey, Beverly. Oh, great to see we've got some international friends. Right. So I think that it's been a couple of minutes. We've got a really lovely group of people making themselves known in the chat. Thank you so much. It's lovely to get a sense of people out there. So I'll say again, my name's Hannah Redler-Hawes. I am an associate at the Open Data Institute, where I'm the curator and director of the Data as Culture Art Programme. And it is my great pleasure and honour to be able to introduce Una Murphy, who has agreed to be our chair for today, and Una will take the reins from here. Thanks, Una.
Brilliant. Thanks, Hannah. And hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. So as Hannah said, my name's Dr. Una Murphy. I'm a senior lecturer in digital culture and society at Goldsmiths University. And I've been a really big fan of Alan's work for a long time, so I was delighted to be asked to chair this session. Unlike everybody else that will be speaking today, I have absolutely nothing to do with this project, so I come to my chairing responsibilities with a genuine curiosity and lots of questions that I want to know myself. So there'll be lots of opportunities for the panelists to share their different perspectives and experiences on the project. But we're also going to invite questions from our audience in the second half of the session. So feel free to drop questions in the chat as we go, and we'll pick them up towards the end. Before we begin, it would be useful for everyone here to meet our panelists. So I'm going to begin by asking Alan to introduce himself. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to briefly introduce themselves and not provide your life story. But what would be really useful, I think, for everyone that's joined us today is if you could just give us a couple of sentences around what your involvement in this project was, because we have lots of different institutional perspectives in here alongside Alan Warburton, who was the artist on the project. So, Alan, over to you for an introduction.
Thank you very much. So I'm the artist, I'm a filmmaker, I'm a researcher. I've been making video essays for about 10 years. Prior to that, I was making 3D animated films, critical artworks, but increasingly over the years, these artworks have become more public facing, more pedagogical, answering some questions that come up in, the sort of cutting edge of imaging technologies. And Image Empire came out of a prolonged period of deep study that I did as part of my PhD. And this was an attempt to sort of intervene in a new space, in a new way, with a new audience.
Great, thanks. Hannah, you've introduced yourself, but do you want to just say a quick line on your relationship to the project?
Yes, so Alan is an artist that we've commissioned before at the Open Data Institute. His Wizard of AI, 99% AI generated film in 2023 that captured that moment when Gen AI became a big thing, has been like wildly successful with our audiences and much broader audiences. And Alan actually approached us to collaborate with him and the National Video Games Museum and the Space in Cambridge on this project. But maybe I'll say more about that in a minute. Shall I?
Great.
Oh, you're going to pick the next person.
Let's go John next.
Thank you, Una. So hi, everybody. I'm John O'Shea. I'm the creative director and co-CEO of the National Video Game Museum, which is based in Sheffield. We're the UK's only independent museum concerned with video games culture, and we care for over 5,000 objects within our collection. My reason for being involved in this project, we're the commissioning organisation, and I've followed Alan's work for over a decade, really excited about the potential to work with Alan. Hannah and Alan working together just seemed like a kind of dream team. And then we were fortunate to work with the Space as supporting the funding of the work. But this work fits into a strand of curatorial activity where we're looking at, we call it behind the screens. So what we're thinking about is how video games come into being. And actually, and we'll talk about this more, for a lot of people, even within the video games industry, increasingly, the processes by which games are made is quite abstract. And the chance to work with Alan to demystify some of those technologies and some of those ideas was really exciting. So thrilled to be involved. Back to Una.
Brilliant, thanks, John. I'm sure there was a lot of celebration when you come up with behind the screens. Excellent projectile. Okay, next, let's go to Harmeet, please.
Hi everyone, I'm Harmeet and I'm Head of Innovation at The Space. And The Space is a digital development organisation that supports organisations and artists to create digitally innovative work and to really find a way to reach new audiences. And the delightful thing for me on our current commissioning slate was that I got to be the exec producer for Image Empire, which meant that I got to kind of spend a bit more time with the team, which was absolutely glorious.
Great, thank you. And our last panelist, over to you, Maya.
Hi, everyone. Very nice to be here with all of you. Thanks for the invitation. My name is Dr. Maya Indira Ganesh, and I'm a research professor, assistant research professor, and associate director at the Leverhulme Center for the Future of Intelligence at the University of Cambridge. And I'm delighted that we had an opportunity to support the launch of Image Empire. I've known Alan and his work for a number of years. So a few weeks ago, we did a screening and a fishbowl event, and I'm happy to talk more about what a fishbowl event is, but it's a form of discussion that we had because we wanted to go into the many issues that Image Empire brings up. So yeah, delighted that we could be part of that and help with that.
Brilliant, thank you everyone. So we have a very short amount of time together today. So before we dive into discussion, let's watch the work of art. If we could play the video, it'll last for 3 minutes.
Something strange has happened in the dark corners of data centers, games engines, and smartphones. Images have multiplied and mutated. They've become intelligent. They're agents of a new image empire. For centuries, two image kingdoms have operated side by side, the real and the virtual. The real uses lenses and sensors to capture light, infrared and radio waves. And the virtual models the world through theories, formulas and equations. The kingdoms are ruled by envious twins, each sworn to a different art, but driven by the same obsession, to see everything, everywhere, all at once. The real tries with all its might to capture the world in one big gulp, but it can only gather disconnected fragments of full 3D experience. It yearns for total capture. The virtual can perform total capture, but only within a hollow mathematical world. While it can mimic just about anything, it seeks life, truth, it wants perfect simulation. So, bound by both envy and ambition, the twins whispered to each other of what is and what could be. A pact was formed. They began exchanging intelligence through a network of shortcuts and hacks, computer vision and computer graphics, sampling and simulation. They filled in each other's blind spots and fed each other's insatiable appetites, turning 2D images to 3D models, 3D models to datasets, datasets to AI models, and envy to empire. And the jewel of that empire? A machine made of a billion eyes, the Graphics Processing Unit. But with their prize now within reach, the twins realized that their ancient quests for empirical data or theoretical axioms had been short-circuited, and their hybrid combination of real and virtual had produced a potent yet unstable whole, and one that could turn knowledge itself inside out. This is what computer scientists call the large world model. A fusion of sampled and simulated data, part game and part brain, half promise and half threat. This mirror world demands an endless stream of images, data and human intelligence to stabilize its powerful hallucinations. It needs you. But what role will you play? Player or NPC? Teacher, translator, or tribute? The rules and rewards are unclear, but the game has already begun. So, choose your avatar wisely, and good luck. Follow the White Rabbit to read the research paper, find details for upcoming events, and for Spanish, Hindi, and Chinese translations.
Great, and if you keep an eye in the chat, we'll be sharing links to the papers that were referenced at the end of the work. So to kick us off, let's speak to the man himself, Alan. Image Empire builds on your work that you've been doing in this space around synthetic and computational image for a long time now. And your work's really been questioning how AI is changing things for the industry, but also different people behind the scenes in different contexts. And so I wonder, what was the target audience for this work? Who did you want this work to speak to when you began to conceptualize it?
So I think it's always been strange for me to work in like commercial spaces as a freelancer in studios, post-production studios, where they're creating adverts and films and so forth, and to see this strange mixture of people who come from a very technical background and people who come from a very creative background coexisting. So these are the two kind of avenues that you take if you go into synthetic imaging, by which I mean CGI, AR, VR, etc., AI. And it's a strange mix because there's two groups of people that think very differently, and people have very different views of technology. A lot of people, the classic phrase is, it's just a tool, right? We hear this all the time in AI discourse. It's just a tool. Get with it. Move with the times. Artists have always, adopted new tools and told new stories. This is, a very well-rehearsed argument that comes from a certain cohort of people that are usually less artistic and more technical. And obviously the artistic people, I count myself as one of them, tend to view new technologies in a much more circumspect way. And also they're more inclined, like me, to reflect on the value of their own labor and where that labor is pointing and how it's being shaped and organized in new ways by new technologies. So that's the kind of fundamental seed of where my interest in this opposition between, I guess we would call it the sort of culture industries and the media industries, or you could call it industry and art. And I saw that community very kind of clearly placed into opposition with each other on LinkedIn. This was where you had a lot of these people working in illustration or advertising or animation, struggling to find new work and hustling on LinkedIn to find new work. And you also found all the sort of disruptors. The people were like, just get with the times, guys. We all need to let go of the past, adopt these new tools, and just tell stories. And so those two kinds of groups really do butt up against each other on LinkedIn. And I wanted to try and tell a story that addressed them both without alienating either, which is a kind of impossible task, but I will probably continue trying to do that for the rest of my life.
And I wonder, just as a follow-on, have you felt from feedback and discussions you've had that the work has spoke to one of those audiences more than the other? Or do you feel like it has kind of landed in that middle space of nuance and reached both sides of the divide almost?
I think perhaps because we are in a very sort of fragmented kind of media ecosystem, if you're not speaking directly to someone's passionately held belief, pro or anti, you're not really content that fits their perspective. So the film tends to be successful and registered with people who have sort of internalize that kind of nuance and are able to hold both perspectives at the same time. And those people operate across industry and art and policy and so forth. So I think it definitely found an audience, but it didn't, I wasn't bringing together these kind of disparate groups, perhaps just simply because that's not how the algorithm works.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. And actually, the challenge of speaking to two audiences is part of the work itself in many ways.
Yeah.
Yeah, great. So I guess picking up on the LinkedIn element, I'm going to come to Harmeet, Hannah, and then John in turn. But Harmeet, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, from your perspective personally, but I guess also from the perspective of the space, what was the significance of creating this work and launching it on LinkedIn? Yeah, what stood out for you through the process of launching this work and producing work that would be experienced on LinkedIn?
Yeah, I mean, for us, there's so much digital content out there. And, when we're trying to encourage artists, and organizations who are commissioning artists to really think about how they're reaching new audiences, the assumption is that if it's digital, everyone will see it. And of course, that assumption is, not true. So for us, we knew that this would make a fascinating case study, as well as presenting, a beautiful new animation from Alan. And so we were interested, to really discover on LinkedIn, where the audiences are, who they are, and what happens to the content when it's distributed straight onto a social media platform. And that's especially important because now trying to reach audiences digitally is more about manipulating the algorithm than it is about gaining insight into developing and reaching audiences in new ways and creating those campfires where, those real conversations, where that ecosystem can really build. So we knew that this was an experiment, and we were massively excited, by the appetite from the whole team that actually they were seeing it as an experiment. And it was, perfect to see, will it create a conversation and a debate in an online space, or actually is that still going to be more gritty and more real in the real life spaces than online?
Yeah, great, thanks. And Hannah, I wonder from your perspective, and I guess also useful, maybe if you could frame this in your wider work, because you've been curating in this digital culture space for a long time. LinkedIn is a novel site to curate within, but you've also curated within lots of novel sites. So it'd be interesting just to get your sense of where this sits into some of the spaces you've maybe worked in before.
Yeah, so I have been curating media, digital, interactive art, interdisciplinary art in novel spaces for 30 years now. And originally, I moved into science and technology spaces back in the 1990s because the art world wasn't interested in this type of work. It wasn't that easy to find spaces to show it. But also, something that I think some science and technology organizations were perhaps a little advanced on the art world in is recognizing that science and technology are culture too. And, this is all stuff that we innovate, we create. And what was really interesting about this piece was making it for a platform that very self-consciously wasn't necessarily even made for art in any way, or cultural product or exhibition. It's sort of more about sort of showing off what you've got for yourself, really. And I suppose through the experiment, one of my questions was, is it really genius, which I still think it was actually, of Alan to say, let's see what happens when we put art on LinkedIn. I think it was genius. But could we all rise to the occasion? Could we game the algorithm, which I didn't realize was going to be as much of a game and as much as a disadvantaged game as it actually is. But also, could we change our behaviors in that space? And I will say that I don't think that we could.
Yeah. And do you want to expand a little bit on that?
Yeah, I think that we hope that we generate some conversation. But what I think, and this is almost pop psychology, what I think sort of we came up against is people are on LinkedIn to present a very particular version of themselves. And this is something Alan and I were talking about this. I think, Alan, I'm right in saying one of your impetuses is back in the day when Twitter was a good space to hang out in and to meet your community and have your water cooler moment, particularly as a freelance creative, freelance curator. We shared a lot of ourselves, but we shared a lot professionally as well. And we were able to find that really beautiful balance between the personal, the professional, the creative drivers, the look at me, I've just done this, and I hope you'd like to find out more about it. But I'd say LinkedIn is a place where it's a lot more self-conscious, and it's a lot more look at me professionally, and it's a lot more broadcast, which is really weird because the whole thing about interactive media was we're moving from the one to many to the many to many, and now it's the ones to one. Or the ones to many, but not each other. I don't know. I think it's really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, it is definitely seems to be a place where we sell our wares rather than build communities.
And who's listening? That's the thing. If we're not having a conversation beyond a like and a whoop, which I am completely guilty of in every direction, what are we actually doing there?
Yeah, I agree. And I think myself and Hannah are both guilty of liking and whooping each other's posts.
All the time.
All the time.
I mean,
yeah.
I don't have to read it, I just whoop. No, I'm joking.
The world's a difficult place. We got to celebrate things when we can.
Yeah.
So John, coming to you, I'm going to ask a really badly formed, very crass question. Should we get rid of museums and just exhibit on LinkedIn? But really, where did this sit for you and for the museum in terms of thinking about alternative platforms of where culture and gaming culture is experienced?
Thank you, Una. Yeah, I mean, so we're quite an unusual museum. We're a museum of video games, which is actually, you know, a very young culture. Video games are an interactive media form that's been around for around 50 years. And so video games themselves are not in a kind of culturally reflective space conventionally. Video games get classed as being quite trivial, get classed as being entertainment. They operate in a very commercial space. So part of our motivation as an organization is to just kind of slow things down and try and create more space to reflect on video games as culture. People are spending a huge amount of time in digital spaces, and often the video game space, in my experience, can be absolutely as rich as a museum exhibition space. So part of our mission is to think about digital experiences in the 21st century and try and reflect on why they matter and why they're valuable. Should we just post things on LinkedIn and stop making exhibitions? I think the sort of proposal from Alan, and then talking to the space with Harmeet, talking more to Hannah about the sort of specifics of LinkedIn as a platform. LinkedIn is a space where people are maybe championing their sort of, this is how fantastic I am professionally. But on the flip side, it's also a space where you'll see people with a kind of open to work sort of notice. You know, it's a place where people are seeking professional opportunities. And for our organization, National Video Game Museum, we're deeply embedded in the video games industry. A lot of our supporters and founders are within the UK video games industry. So for us, we thought putting something into our LinkedIn feed that was less, just talking about us as a charity, but also was maybe slightly problematizing and asking questions about some of the technologies behind video games seemed like an interesting thing to do. What we weren't sure about was how LinkedIn kind of operates as an audience-facing platform. It's been an interesting experiment.
Great. And I wonder, just kind of picking up on the behind the screen program that you mentioned, which focuses on adults. What sort of questions and issues has this commission allowed you to raise and open kind of discussions with those audiences?
I think the questions it's thrown up is perhaps one part of it. I think the reason we commissioned the work is we were getting from our adult audiences questions about AI all of the time, and questions from specialists. I remember hosting an event made in South Yorkshire, looking at brilliant video game companies that are based in the region, and a spoken voice actor was in the audience, and they said, "This is my question. Where is my job? I've been working for 20 years and trained my voice, but now there are technologies that can fully replicate my voice. What am I supposed to do?" And we felt like, as an institution, we didn't really have anything in our collection, or we didn't really have the expertise to properly, or the language to properly speak to that kind of question. So really, in commissioning Alan's work with Maya and with Harmeet and with Hannah and all of these organizations, what we're trying to do is enable artists to start to provide some of the language. On LinkedIn, though, we have had some good engagement, and people can go to that link and we can engage further on that platform. But I think what Alan's work is helping us to do is to and it's built around metaphor, it's built around a fable, really, and it's providing a language to describe this quite abstract, deliberately abstract technology.
Yeah, great. And I think, Alan, this is a really good point to bring you back in. So you've described Image Empire as a kind of a ways of seeing for the age of AI. And I wonder, can you say a little bit more about that, and also just pick up on maybe some of John's points about the challenges of explaining what AI is to those that are impacted or affected by it, and what this work seeks to achieve in that space.
Yeah, I mean, the ways of seeing is such an important touchstone for, I guess, popular art history. I guess that would be its genre. But also, I was interested in public information films. Both of these things are really trying to open out the audience for media literacy projects, or public benefit. There's just general sense that we can expand who gets included in the conversation around new technology. We're not trying to make everyone an expert. We're just trying to bump everyone up a little bit so that they can be a bit more curious, potentially. And I think especially of those people who are working with the technologies, because quite often the development of new technologies is outsourced to audiences, subscribers of, Adobe. We're all kind of involved in prototyping and R&D, and bringing a little bit more of that awareness of our own sort of complicity with technological hype cycles, and the kind of horizon of what the technological imaginary. We're all invested in that to some degree. So yeah, it's about media literacy, and trying to do media literacy in a way that doesn't alienate people. Does that answer your question? I can't remember the second part.
It does, and it also leads very nicely into the next question I had. So we appreciate the flow. I'm going to pass on to Harmeet and ask a question about audience development. So Harmeet, I guess speaking from the perspective of the space, Alan talked a little bit there about, media literacy and being accessible to people. From your perspective, working with creative technologists, working with artists, what does effective audience development look like in terms of engaging new audiences? Are there any surprising strategies that have worked? Maybe some examples, but also just maybe a reflection in terms of thinking about audience development, specifically for Alan's project.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's really well, this has always been the case, but I think it's the appetite for artists to want to use AI and implement it within their artistic work is increasing. We see that in our commissioning slate and our applications that we get in all the time. And artists by their very nature now, I think, are more, activists, and political commentators than just creating things that are beautiful and compelling. So artists are wanting to take the tech and be daring and break it. And that brings up questions around permission and gatekeeping and where the data goes. So it's linked in with this kind of like moral dilemma. But those same artists, and I also say that with my own artist head on, they're hungry to disrupt those social and cultural and political norms and tell those stories, and then hand it back to the audience. So they're kind of not hidden from what those insights are, So really interesting artists like Playful, where you can game your way through an experience built with AI. And then actually at the end, you can decide whether your data will feed back into the larger language model, that they've used to try and convince, the AI to think, are you a person or are you a plant crossing, a road, all those kinds of things. And it makes it really fun, but it also makes the audience think about what's really happening and their relationship to AI. And I think that's crucial here. But then you also have artists like Joseph Wilk, who's, using AI to like really push back what frameworks of disability mean. And actually, that's really, really important because quite often we see artists, again, being able to level up and use technology in a new way. And I suppose what we've also seen, and this conversation never goes away, is there's not enough money, right? But we're in the cultural sector. We're not sitting in a commercial space. There's just not enough money. And so artists are going, well, actually, if we implement AI creative tools, we can vibe code everything. We can, make, a new piece of work with a smaller team because, suddenly the processes and the pipelines have been reduced and we don't need to have a team of 5. We can do it with a team of 2, And so actually, I think what that brings up is really about kind of questioning, the funding that's available in the arts and cultural sector and what the value is of culture itself. And so the real outreach, I think, happens with projects like this, which do push back that curtain. It's when you have the work, audiences experience it, whether it's online and it works or it doesn't work, or it's kind of very superficial. I always think that LinkedIn is kind of the space where it's like when you spray perfume into a room and it lasts for a really, really short amount of time and then it disappears forever. And you're constantly trying to grab those molecules back again and go, was that a moment in time or not? But it's also about going, how do you replicate that in those real spaces, And then you can have those really gritty conversations with your audiences. You can show them, this is how we did it. This is why we did it. And should we carry on doing it? And I think those creative conversations become intrinsically linked to the production, to those big ethical and moral questions, and also about sort of like the questions that I'm hearing about what is the alternative? And I think that's when the audience become like they sit in a space where they start to take ownership, not just of the piece of work they're experiencing, like with Image Empire, but the call to action to kind of ask them, what does this mean for me? And that's really important.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because like so many things, it actually parallels to, non-technical experiences. So, in arts and culture, we've long talked about the audience contract and this idea of, your ability to make decisions, behavior contracts. If you go to the theatre, you shouldn't talk during the show, you shouldn't eat food loudly. We've always experienced art through these kind of contractual relationships, primarily socially and in person. And so it's interesting now we're moving this kind of audience contract online. And who gets to be a character in this contractual negotiation is now not only the commissioner, the producer, the artist, but also the platform that is hosting the work. And that's an interesting challenge in itself because it's a negotiation.
Absolutely.
So Maya, I just want to bring you in at this point. So you kind of worked in in launching the video, and I think your kind of framing and your perspective is really useful in terms of situating this work. So you've talked about how Image Empire speaks to the ways that we now have to navigate these new social relations that are emerging between legacy, institutional norms, and emerging forms of cultural consumption, new patterns of socioeconomic, socio-technical phenomenon. And I wonder if you can give some examples of what this looks like. And again, very much really feeds into Harmeet's discussion and her thinking about, what is this audience contract? How do we experience and understand these emerging forms of culture?
Sure. Thanks. Yeah, and the conversation has just been great, and I want to maybe pick up on one or two things that have been said already in sort of talking about how we did the launch. So, at the end of the film, Alan poses this question about what role will you play? And I think that's been a really interesting and important question for me as somebody who works between the social sciences and the humanities and also works as a cultural practitioner and writer. And I'm kind of interested in the audience conversation, to what you were saying about the audience contract. And spaces like LinkedIn, whether we're in digital fora or offline, there are scripts and roles that we're performing. And so, I don't think that you and Hannah should feel bad about the whooping and liking. We're all just kind of like, following certain scripts and social norms of these places. So I wanted to sort of think about an event we might do where people are able to have that conversation about how we situate ourselves in relation to AI and what's happening. Because I think many of us might have this experience of when we go into a situation where we're talking about AI, one part of the conversation is rhetorical. We're commenting on how we're talking about AI, and then we're talking about clarifying to other people whether they've got it right or wrong, addressing myths or fears, hypes and anxieties. And then there's the what do you do? What should we be doing in this moment? So I wanted to have a place and a moment where we could surface all of these. And so we did a little fishbowl where we basically break the format of a panel. And while we have some experts who kick off the conversation, we also have other people coming into the conversation. So from the audience. So indeed, we saw all of these things play out. And one of the things that, we talked about work and what does it mean to be somebody who works in these industries, but also somebody who feels they're subject to things like AI. So for instance, you could have thinking about work and labor, again, there's the anxiety around people being AI is going to take my jobs, and this is like take our jobs, and this is a very broad framing. But I think what we sort of brought out, I think, in the conversation that we had at the launch was that we have identities strongly associated with the work that we do. And if you're a creative practitioner, if you work in the games industry or creative industries or culture industries, your understanding of what you do is changing, and it's never really just one thing. It is fraught, and it is also sometimes exciting and challenging. So I think that that's one of the things that people are having to grapple with, that their own sort of subjective understanding of what they do as skilled practitioners is changing, and we often don't have language for that. The other thing I'll say is that there's people who are feeling subject to the technology. So we have people who are trying to sort of position themselves in relation to it. And so we had, for example, people who say, I want to know what this means for the future of work, especially if you're dealing with young people in a school or university context, what to study, what to do. So I think both those things are real, and they came out through our conversation. And the last thing I'll say is, I feel like you can only have these conversations in fairly narrow, specific ways. So creating those opportunities where you can have an artist showing a work and then inviting people to go a little deeper and struggle over them. And I think that's kind of what I feel like we really got that out of the fishbowl, where there were some contestations. And I'm happy to talk about what exactly those were. And Hannah and Alan were in the room as well, and will remember some of those conversations.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Maya. And I think sitting with the uncomfortable is such an important part of really developing what this new audience contract is, what this new experience is. And I think just picking up on that institutional perspective, I'm going to ask Hannah a question, then I'm going to ask Alan a question, and then I'm going to open it to our audience. So feel free to start popping some questions in chat as we go. Hannah, so we've kind of talked a little bit there about audience contract, about how audiences experience and engage with this work, but we've also talked about kind of new institutional relationships. And I wonder if you could just give us a little bit of context about why is the Open Data Institute working with an artist? What's the relationship there? What's the value that the ODI see in Alan's work?
So that's a brilliant question. So I've been with the Open Data Institute since 2014, which is 2 years after it inaugurated in 2012. And when it opened in 2012, on day one, there was an art program, which is Data as Culture, which was founded by the artist Julie Freeman. And Julie had been to the leaders of the Open Data Institute and said, if you're going to be doing something, founding an institute, that is going to prepare the world to move from a web of documents to a web of machine readable data and all of this. This is about the next stage of the World Wide Web. This is about the future internets. This is about network culture, and this is a culture that we're all enmeshed in. So you can't really do that without artists. And they agreed. And so literally from day one, artists were involved in the organization. And I think that because the ODI is very small, it's very fleet of foot, it's not for profit, but its main vision to make a world where data works for everyone is something that needs a really holistic view. And it's something where people are trying to define very complex and abstract concepts and apply them in the real world to government policy, to institutional bureaucracies, to business drivers. And in order to do that, there's actually some really deep thinking. And what you find if you look through the history of art is that artists have often done that thinking first. So when Alan came to me and said, I want to make this piece of work called Image Empire, it's addressing this content, I want to launch it on LinkedIn to sort of build a conceptual bridge between people in tech and people in the creative industries. It didn't directly map onto any of the existing Open Data Institute projects. And that's unusual. We've had many artists in residence who have worked with our researchers, and we've often invited artists or done open calls. So this was an artist coming to us and saying, I want to work with you. But what it really reminded me of is the early goals, which are still ongoing, of the ODI to build a data infrastructure and open up conversations between businesses and their clients and their users, between governments and their citizens. So it's about unearthing the questions that need to be asked in order to move to the next stage. And I feel like Alan is really nailing something with Image Empire, with the film and the accompanying paper, of saying this is a conversation that needs to be had now. We don't have the answers. He's opening the conversation. He's asking us, what would you do? He's creating space and he's creating language for us to sit with that difficulty and address that difficulty collectively. And he's also creating some metaphors that are easily digestible for people on all sides of the coin. I know coins only have two sides, but all sides of the arguments, I'm going to say. And that's kind of got a parallel with other work that's happening at ODI, like Data-Centric AI, which is a research program led by Eleanor Simple, looking at questioning the assumptions and of AI and data for AI and sort of unpacking the hype. So the technological worlds that we're moving into, the models that we're working with that exist that are satisfactory, the models that we're living with that exist and are unsatisfactory, and the models that may or may not happen depending on many, many drivers, including us, actually, although we may not always feel as powerful, are yet to be created. And I think that it won't happen if we don't have the vision and the conversations. So for me, this piece was absolutely the sort of thing that Data as Culture should be continuing to do. On top of which, the chance to work with Alan again and the amazing partners, National Video Game Museum, The Space, and Cambridge Leverhulme Centre for Future of Intelligence was obviously too good to pass up.
Brilliant, thanks, Hannah. And really good just to get that wider context of ODI's thinking in this space and the value that artists can add to your work, to the work of NGOs in terms of thinking differently about these grand challenges of our time. And artists don't always provide answers to difficult questions, but they provide new ways, new frameworks, new pathways in to understanding how we might kind of develop a consensus, a way forward in those kind of when we're stuck in the weeds and we don't know where to go next. And I think it's such an interesting way to think about how artists can help us with some of these challenges, these unresolved issues that the technologies are presenting us with.
And I just want to build on that and just say that artists can help us, but artists can also problematize it, which can be very unhelpful and very disruptive. But that's something that we really, really need to do. And back to the funding, I know anecdotally how much value Data as Culture has brought to the ODI. I know that in, 14, 15 years, in masses of change in the organization, the Data as Culture program has consistently continued. Our funding goes up and down, and at the moment we're on an externally funded model. But what I've never had is the budget to do a really proper evaluation of the value that artwork is bringing. And I'm seeing this across, I'm freelance as well, across museums, all sorts of institutions. There's not enough money to properly chart the value of art and blue sky thinking, pure conceptual artistic practice. And I think that actually, Ellen, I think this piece really feeds into that as well, because it calls for it.
Yeah, great, thank you. And I think let's bring it back to Alan then, to the work. So we've seen the film and we've talked about it, but I also just want to talk a little bit about the paper as well, because this kind of conceptual framing is very much part of the piece. The film is not standalone, it sits within this wider ecosystem. And so one of the things that the video, but the paper particularly picks up on is this idea of world models. And I just wonder if you could, this is your chance to bring us all into your world. What exactly is a world model, and how does that intersect with games?
Yeah. So picking up on some of the stuff that Hannah's just mentioned about the sort of role of artists, I don't think I should be the authority in telling the world what a world model is. But the strength of me doing it is that often artists can resort to metaphors and use those in a really interesting way to open up complex technical topics to wider understanding. And this is something that's very difficult to do with the concept of the world model. And there's a few ways of approaching it. I sort of tried this kind of fairy tale metaphor in the film, and then I kind of unpack that in the field guide. And I'd encourage anyone who hasn't read that to give it a go. It's not as hard as you think it might be. But over the past few weeks, I've been writing other things and trying to understand the sort of wider significance of the world model. And it really is, I mean, Hannah's mentioned, the World Wide Web as this kind of structuring template of society. The transition is, I think, in my sort of gut, I feel this, that the web was essentially digested and turned into a model. And that model can be an LLM, or it can be generative AI, or it can be this large world model, which is essentially a playground for agentic AI. So this idea that we're creating a kind of a black box that is sort of spatial for AI agents to learn about cause and effect within. And the easiest way I think of imagining it is, as children, we all learn over the course of 5 or 6 years how to predict whether if we push something, it's going to fall off a table and smash and the cat will get scared and run away. This is essentially what the latest generation of world models are trying to do. They're trying to get autonomous AI agents to have that kind of mental rehearsal space. So it's not necessarily linked to visuality anymore. The front line of this new technology is not generative AI. It's not painting pictures of fantastical scenarios. It's actually a kind of very black boxed cognitive space for non-human intelligence. So that's maybe the easiest way of unpacking what a world model is in the latest iteration, Jan LeCun's JEPA architecture, which is currently the one that's receiving all the funding.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Alan. Yeah, just really useful in terms of the kind of the wider technical concepts that we see in both the paper and the work itself. So just having a quick look at questions here. I'm going to use chair's prerogative and pick one because I would also like to know the answers to it. Barbary has asked, would love to hear more about the contestations in the fishbowl. And in our prep session for this webinar yesterday, we had a little discussion about this. Maya, you weren't in our prep session yesterday, so I'd love to hear your take on it. I've heard a few other people's take on the format and some of the challenges in it. But yeah, so what happened? Give us what went down at the fishbowl. What did you learn? I guess a bit about format, and a bit also just about where the challenges in positionality sat.
Right. So let me start by laying out the space quite literally. So everybody knows what a typical panel looks like. It's a bit like this, where you have a bunch of people sitting at one end of a room and you have the audience listening to them. So it's very much in a sort of theatrical mode. And the panel is comprised of experts who say their thing, and then, the chair invites the audience to ask questions, and the audience hears the answers from the experts. What a fishbowl does is try to complicate that question-answer format and assumes that there's a lot of expertise that people in the audience have and maybe need a way to kind of become part of the conversation where they start posing questions as well. So the format is that rather than having this sort of theatrical setup, you have another kind of theatrical setup where you have a circle, a small circle in the middle of a group of people. That's the fishbowl. And then you have concentric circles of chairs of people sitting around. And the idea is that anybody who's in the center is talking, and people on the outside are listening and observing. When someone in the middle has finished speaking, they have an opportunity to get up and become part of the audience, and somebody from the audience can go and sit in the middle. So that's the format we went with. And we had a group of experts. We did have a panel, but they were sitting in the middle. They kicked off the conversation. And the trade-off with a fishbowl is that sometimes you can have difficult conversations, or things can kind of get extended in one direction, and there's so many different ideas. And then you want to get back to a conversation that happened 5 minutes ago, and you have to hold it for a while because it's kind of a little bit unmoderated in a way. So one of the contestations that happened pretty early on was somebody who has a background in physics and machine learning and is a software programmer and scientist working in Silicon Valley, quite early on came and sat in the inner circle, moved from the audience and sat in the inner circle, and basically mansplained, I would say, to people who were in the audience, but also to Alan and Hannah and others who were in the circle, what they didn't understand about AI and how it actually really works. And there were actually some technical things that he said that I don't understand. Alan probably knows them. I think there were some specific details about models and model architectures. And what was really interesting about what he said and kind of how he said it was because he, as a scientist, understood something about AI. The artist's perception and the artist's rendition of the experience of this technology in our world and people's discussion was somehow, he was invalidating those experiences by saying, see, you don't really understand the technology and how it works. You're downstream from it somewhere. And what you're getting to see is not actually how it works. And the thing is, AI is, it's mathematical techniques, it's narratives, it's cultural narratives, it's also marketing. So there's a lot of layers of mediation between probably where he's sitting and where somebody else is sitting. But the whole point of the fishbowl is to be able to recognize these different positionalities. But this gentleman was unable to do that. And what was quite funny was he kind of said his piece, he dropped his mic, literal and figurative mic, he left and then he came back, and he sort of said very similar kinds of things in both contexts, kind of splainy, scientist splainy stuff. I'll stop there.
Great.
Maybe Hannah and Alan have other things they want to add about that, but it was this idea of you don't understand and your experience is somehow not valid.
Yeah, so I think it was just a really interesting point to pick up on in that Hannah, we kind of talked at the start about kind of the performative nature of LinkedIn and actually the ability to have deep, difficult conversations is quite, it's quite challenging to do on LinkedIn because we're all perfect people with perfectly formed opinions. So it's interesting actually that whilst the work was platformed on LinkedIn with this idea of starting a conversation, actually the kind of the difficult conversation was at an in-person event. And again, it comes back to that conversation, that thinking around like how we consume, engage with digital culture, what the audience contract is. So I'm conscious of time. So I'm going to throw our last question over to Alan, and I'm going to give him 2 minutes to ask probably the most difficult question of the day. Would you make a work for LinkedIn again?
Yeah, I might actually, but it wouldn't involve video. Making 2D animation was a big gamble because really what I was trying to do was get people on board on both sides with my use of media and use that media in a tricky way. So the thing is, what all the techie bros love more than anything else is analog media because it embodies this idea of craft and it has this kind of aura about it. And yet all that they're doing really is trying to automate that and make it easier and open it up for people who don't have those skills to produce the same thing. So in a way, I was sort of using 2D animation as a way of kind of slightly undermining that. However, 2D animation is incredibly difficult to make. It takes such a long time. And also LinkedIn doesn't like video. That's essentially the big lesson is that they deprioritize video. So if I was to make something for LinkedIn, it would probably be text-based. It would be far more provocative. It would probably sort of inherit many of the kind of techniques devised over the past 30 or 40 years within art to kind of disrupt spaces through, pretending to be one thing when you're actually another. So there's a kind of psyop approach or a counterintelligence approach that might work better on LinkedIn, just purely because of what it is and how it works. So I'll never say never.
Great. Well, on that note, I'm going to thank all of my panelists for their contributions today. I think it's very rare to have a panel with such diverse backgrounds and experiences. But I think also just the varying institutional perspectives that were represented in the commissioning and curatorial process adds a really unique perspective to thinking about what digital culture is, how we commission it, curate it, but also how we experience it as audiences. And I think Alan's been so generous in supporting this kind of ecosystem to essentially carry out research and development, to explore and think rather than to deliver a final product. It's very much been a case of exploring what the ecosystem might look like and what change that can affect. So thanks everyone for joining. Do check out the links in chat and do go and read Alan's paper that goes alongside the film we showed at the start of the session.
Thanks so much, Una. It was really great to have you hosting us and bringing us together. And thanks, everyone.